George Schoffman. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family. We were very prominent businessmen around the turn of the century here in St. James. Family originally came, my grandpa came from the Alsace area of France back in about the mid-1800s. In fact, about 1845, we moved to Wisconsin. I had all my aunts and uncles were born in France, all except for my dad, where he was born just north of Milwaukee in Wisconsin. So of course that's where he grew up at, and in about 1859 they decided that they were going to try moving west to check out this new frontier out in Minnesota. And so they took off by ox team and came across Wisconsin, and they made it as far as Owatonna. When they got to Owatonna, they realized that, you know, this whole frontier thing might just not be for us. So they turned the ox team around and went south, and so my father ended up growing up in Illinois. Well, the frontier thing really intrigued him. And so when he was old enough, he moved away from home and he moved to Mankato, where at that time 3 of his sisters were already living in Mankato. And so once he was in Mankato, he started working there, and then he went down and started working in Mapleton, where he ran a hotel. And it was about this time that's where he met my mother, and they got married. Now my mother was at the ripe old age of 15 when they got married. Wow. After their wedding in January of that year in Mankato, they rode a horse-drawn sleigh down to Mapleton to the hotel that my dad worked at. They worked there for many years. He started his own business in 1881 down in Minnesota Lake then. Ran that for about 6 years and then sold that off and moved to Mankato. And he lived in Mankato for about a year prior to moving here to St. James in 1888. When he moved to St. James here, he bought out the general store from T.C. Velton. And he ran that for a few years. And in 1893, he decided it was time to retire. At this point in time, my father was 46 years old when he retired. During that time, he built one of the very first brick buildings on Main Street, which became, as you all may know it, as Johnson Hardware. Later on, he built another big brick building. The first building was called the Schoffman building. The second one is called the Schoffman block, and that's the one that's on the corner right now where Superstone Tapes is at. The Masons for many years rented the second floor of the Schoffman building as their lodge. In 1901, so about 8 years after he retired the first time, my dad, he wasn't very good about staying retired. He actually came out of retirement three times. But in 1901 he came out of retirement again, and with me we started up our own general store ourselves. It was the Schoffman store. Later on, when my younger brother Raleigh got old enough, he joined the business, and that's when my dad finally retired the last time, and it became known as the Schoffman Brothers. So I've got a brother. My older brother's name is William. He was also very prominent in town. He actually worked at the bank. When he was 18 years old, after he graduated, he went to Mankato and took a course in business. And after that, he came back here and he started working at a new bank in town called the First National Bank, which is the new bank in St. James. It was the only bank in St. James. He worked there for many years. He was involved in a lot of different business transactions around St. James. And things were going quite well with him. He was an assistant cashier. He served on the bank, the board of directors. And him and a friend of his, Crowley, started a business together. And they opened up the first automobile dealership in St. James in 1911. And it was the Ford Garage. Now, him and Crowley had a lot of business dealings together. In 1914, they added the Oldsmobile line to their Ford line that they sold. And also around that time, they went out to Long Lake, which is just south of here, and bought 12 acres of land and started trying to promote the development of Long Lake. And on the 12 acres of land, they opened up the Long Lake Park. In this park, there was 4 other people involved with it. It was Thomas Tennyson, There's the Sterry family, the Schoffmans, the Crowleys, the Veltums, the Crouch brothers, and William Manning. They all worked on this together. They came up with about $3,000 to purchase the land and start improving it. They erected a bathhouse out there. They had refreshment stands. And they also had a dance pavilion that was about 40 feet by 70 feet to be able to have dances out by the lake.
Okay, that answers the question I had.
Must have been Newton's.
I didn't know who built that pavilion.
Yep. So do you remember the pavilion that was out
Oh,
there?
yeah.
Oh, heavens,
Okay.
yes.
Duke Randall ran it for many,
Yep.
many years.
Yep. So that's who
And I
originally built
didn't
it.
know if Duke built it or somebody else built it. And my grandparents lived in the back when my dad was about 2.
Oh, really? Okay.
And my uncle was about 4.
So if you see the pictures that are passing around, it was also a big thing that my brother and Crowley used to have a big picnic for everybody with their Ford vehicles, and they'd have everybody come out, and they'd have a band playing. And so we got some pictures of 1913 and 1914 of all these Ford cars out there, and everybody having a big picnic. Well, my brother had kind of a tough life. He got married, and their first child died as an infant. The second child was William Jr., and of course he survived. But when William was about 4 years old, his mother got very sick, and she passed away after about 5 months of illness. Now, she was originally from Viroqua, Wisconsin, and so after she passed away, they had a small funeral for her here, and then she went back and they buried her in the family plot back in Viroqua. So, but not long after that, about a year after that, my brother remarried in 1915. And he married Sophia Wingen. She was a wonderful woman. She kind of took William in as her own son and gave him a happy home. She was originally a teacher. She's from St. Clair. She taught in St. Clair. She came to St. James. She taught at the St. James School District for about 3 years prior to getting married. Well, they were very happily married for about 4 years. And then in 1919, my brother William came down with the Spanish flu. Now, just to give you some ideas to what the Spanish flu was, there was a big pandemic that occurred in about 1918, 1919, where the flu came around. And it was spread even worse because that was right at the end of World War I. Of course, the flu did come about prior to the end of the war, but it made it worse because of the end of the war, and people were moving around so much and it's spreading. And it's a little bit different than the normal flus that you're used to, in that it affected young adults worse than anybody else. Children, the ages that it affected the worst was the ages of 20 to 40. And so if you were young, or if you were middle-aged or older, you typically weren't going to get hit with this flu as bad as what the young adults were. In fact, most of the people that died from the Spanish flu were in that 20 to 40-year-old age range. They guessed that about 650,000 Americans died in 1918 and 1919 from that flu outbreak. During that time, so when you had the flu, of course they would quarantine your house because it was also very catchy. And about 50% of the people that came into contact with somebody with the flu would come down with it themselves. And out of that, about 20% of the people would succumb to it and die. Well, my brother was part of that 20%. He came down with it, and right after he got it, a secondary infection set in, and he came down with pneumonia. And so after being sick for a week, of course, he passed away. Well, at that same time, of course, because his wife was taking care of him when he first came down with it, she became sick. So then my mother decided that she would come over and help. And then my mother became sick with the flu, and so all three of them were quarantined at the same time. And so they ended up having to hire a trained nurse to come in and take care of the family during that time. And then my brother, of course, when he passed away in the quarantine, the funeral was quite small. And they ended up burying my brother down in Mankato at the Calvary Cemetery. Now, like as I said, he was very involved in St. James. He started out as the bookkeeper at the bank and made his way up to being assistant cashier. He also served as the city treasurer for many years, so he was very active that way, just as my dad was. My dad was very involved. He was sat on the city council for many years in St. James. Myself, well, I was born about 4 years after my brother William. I was born over in Minnesota Lake before we moved here. I was about 8 years old when we moved here. When I was about 20 years old, I learned that I had a heart problem. The doctors call it a leakage. I'm not sure what that means, but I know that I just don't have the stamina to be able to do stuff like I used to. In about 1922, I came down with a bad bout of the flu, and I never really recovered from it. I spent the next 5 years in a very weakened state. I wasn't able to get stronger. In 1923, I came down with the flu a second time, and that one basically knocked me out. And so 1924 is when I passed on. Now, my wife, Nellie, was a wonderful woman. She was very involved in the church, but she was also very involved with the hospital. In fact, she was one of the founding members, and she was the only treasurer for the hospital auxiliary up until the time of her passing. I had a younger brother, Raleigh. Now, as I said, I started in business with my father in 1901. My brother turned 18, that was Raleigh, and he's the one that came into business with me. We became known as the Schoffman brothers. He ran the Schoffman brothers with me until my passing. And then he ran the business again for about another 4 years after that, so before he finally sold the business off to other businessmen in St. James. And then here we have my sister Rose. Now, Rose married Albert Hyertz, and the Hyertzes were very prominent in St. James as well. They actually had a clothing store in St. James. And so Rose and Albert continued in that capacity with the clothing store up until his passing in 1929. Now, Rose stayed around St. James for a few years after that. She stayed around St. James until about 1955, but after that she moved on, and she moved out to California. And that she passed away in 1986, and they brought her back here to be with her husband. My father and mother both lived past me and my brother William. They lived well into the 1930s, and they are also both buried down in Mankato with my brother, down at the Calvary Cemetery, down in Old Mankato there. So, and I did have 3 other siblings that passed away in emergency as well. Just back then, that's the story of the Schoffman family, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Now, the pictures have, some of the pictures that you see here, the one is an article that was written a few years back, and it shows a bunch of houses that my family built. My parents, the main house that they built when they first came here, many of you may know as the Wenstrom house.
Oh, yeah.
That was their house that they built. My family and our kids and stuff built a lot of other houses around town. Right next to the Historical Society, the Hermo house, that was one of the houses that was built. The house that's on the corner by the Presbyterian Church, where the Ericksons live, Cleo Erickson lives, my family built that house. Also the house that used to be next to the Presbyterian Church that was moved away, that currently Jepsons live in, that was another house that my family built. A couple of blocks over were Ruth and Bunny Epland. The house they bought was another house that we built, and the house next door to that was another house that my family built. And so there's been a lot of documentation as to the houses that our families built, and there's a lot of similarities. A lot of them were stucco houses. That was one of our family's big things we liked, and there were a lot of different similarities with the different houses. So.
Very interesting.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.